The motorcycle, May 28, 1925. Beyond the back blocks. The difficulties of the first trip to be made round Australia on a motorcycle by A.W. Grady. Part 1. On October the 1st last year, I started from Fremantle on what is generally recognised as the longest and most difficult journey ever attempted on a motorcycle, the ride around Australia. Space and weight were strictly limited, so that comforts which are generally deemed necessities such as blankets, towels, razor, etc. were left behind. My whole swag comprised an army oilskin ground sheet and a mosquito net which, tightly wrapped, were attached to the front fork side. A toothbrush was carried in a pocket. 2 cans firmly braced to the sides of the carrier gave me an extra petrol capacity of 3 gallons. The ordinary tank in the machine, a chain drive 348cc Douglas, held 1.5 gallons of petrol and 1 quart of oil. An extra gallon of oil was also carried. On top of the carrier was a Nobles cartridge box which contained spare parts, tyre mending outfits, etc. Outside the port petrol tank, a 2-gallon water bag was swung. All on, including myself, we tipped the scales at 450 pounds, a big weight for a little Douglas to carry. Systematic stowage of kit. I also took a small first aid outfit with a good supply of fever mixture to combat troubles with mosquitoes and dysentery from constantly changing waters, and for general ailments. The 2-pound jam tin bolted to the back number plate served as a tea billy. It was often mistaken for a rain gauge. Some hard corned beef, the tins usually tied to the handlebar, tea and sugar constituted the cuisine. Bates oversized tyres were fitted to the machine, and from previous experience of this make, I was convinced they would do good work. I had yet to learn how much better they were than I believed at starting. After uplifting send-offs from Fremantle and Perth, I pushed along for 4 days, and then leaving the fenced fields of wheat, entered the red soil Murchison district, with its surface strewn with millions of double Gs. These hard seeds, with their 3 sharp spikes, affect the feet of the sheep so seriously as often to prevent travel. Often my tyre treads were invisible, being covered with a mass of these pronged seeds, but none succeeded in penetrating to the inner tube. Next came the Gascoyne district, with its numerous rivers and creeks, making travel very severe. These 2-station districts have some wonderful, well-constructed homesteads, electrically lighted and surrounded by gardens of flowers and vegetables, and are eloquent testimony of the profit there is in sheep rearing in Western Australia. In the next district, in Miniljar, I travelled on occasion 14 hours a day without changing once out of low gear. Deep, heavy sand, loose and red and churned into powder by wagon teams and heavy lorries, constituted the road. There are a few miles of good road between Onslow and Fort Headland, but with this exception, the 800 miles ahead to Halls Creek was said to be all sand. In the grip of sand. From Derby one noticed how the stations started to thin out, the distances between them being 60 to 80 miles apart. There are fewer sheep, the countless mobs of kangaroos disappear, the curious emu strides ostentatiously in front to try his paces against the Douglas. No more flocks of wild turkeys flap their way into the sky as one surprises them, and in their place appears a stubborn bullock, with his neck arched and horns advanced to welcome one. A glimpse of a sneaking dingo lurking in the bush, or the swish of parted air as a flock of flying foxes flit phantom-like overhead. Here the country was in the throes of drought, and there were dead sheep and dead kangaroos everywhere. A carter whom I met heading south with cart and 2 horses told me he had a job at Mulga Downs as windmill expert at £6 per week, but that as it cost him £3 per week to feed his horses, he had to leave. Throughout the Kimberley and Fitzroy districts, it is all low gear work through heavy sand. One night I camped with a teamster who told me of a sand pull that had cost him £50. His loaded wagons were axle deep in shifting sand, and the team of 50 mules was unable to move it. He then put on 70 mules, and they simply tore the harness to pieces, and the wagon had to be lightened by removing 3 tons of the load. At Halls Creek I met Sergeant Flinders and Constable Turner, who captured a bloodthirsty blackfellow, Banjo, after many months of searching through the wild tribes. Banjo lived near Halls Creek Station, and one day the bloodlust overcame him and he secured a rifle and put a bullet through one of the men in charge. Followed a whole series of gruesome murders. On receipt of the news, the 2 intrepid policemen started hot on Banjo's trail. Then began some wonderful tracking by the black trackers, for Banjo used amazing ingenuity in masking and hiding his tracks. He walked backwards for 4 miles and travelled night and day. Eventually they tracked him to a wire fence where his tracks disappeared. No signs of any were visible except those of a dog, which ran along the fence. Banjo walked 5 miles on that wire fence, but forgot about the tracks the following dog was making. At last they hounded him down, but he resisted and fell, riddled with bullets. From Halls Creek to Esau's is a distance of 10 miles, where lives an old hermit, Esau, aged 92, and 8 miles to Palm Springs, a garden amid the stony ranges, where I decided to stay the night and remarked to the owner, "I think I shall camp outside, it will be cooler." "If you do, you will be the first man who has done so for years," he said, "for snakes are very numerous. When I awake at night, I can hear them crawling about on the floor. The bunks inside, I saw, were suspended by chains from the roof, so as to be clear of snakes. I slept inside." Gruesome relic on a peak. To Flora Valley, 18 miles. The track was mountainous and stony. Along here I took a heavy fall and damaged my leg. This range of mountains, which continues for 36 miles, is known locally as the Razorbacks. The upgrades were almost impossible for my mount to scale, even with me pushing all out. On top of one of these ridges are the manes of a horse balanced with front and hind legs swinging in the air on either side, his body resting on the summit. From Flora Valley to Soakage Creek is a distance of 60 miles, and here I had a bath. Buckins carried water for an overhead bucket rigged as a shower. After dining on tomatoes and securing a gallon of petrol, I started for Birrindudu, 65 miles, to which the only trail was the track of 2 horses that had gone along 3 weeks before. I had constantly to get off and walk to distinguish between the horse tracks and those of bullocks. However, I got along fairly well in spite of the going being fairly rough. Virgin ground with many cattle pads. The surface was covered with spine effects, which are prickly, turfed grass, Mitchell grass and stumps. However, I arrived at Sweetwater Yards, so named from the water having a sweet, unpalatable taste, where the cattle pads split into dozens. Here I scouted on foot for 2 hours following pads, which spun out until I eventually trailed the fresh horse tracks. It was at these yards that the two overlanders, Turry and Yockney, in a Ford car, lost the pad and nearly perished in the vast trackless plain. They had a few directions from the Inverary station, but the ground offered no tracks, however faint, and they wandered almost fatally. I had not even their few directions and had to depend entirely on the compass and the horse tracks. However, I followed these tracks for another 28 miles, and the going was so diabolical that at times I doubted if I could be right. At last, to my great relief, I reached the second well, and there spent the hour following pads till I saw the few rough buildings on the left of the Sturt River. Devils in Iron and Steel. This river is covered with long cane grass and has a loose, soily bottom with no crossing whatsoever. After struggling in it for about 15 minutes, I decided to get help from the Blacks' camp, but on reaching the camp, I discovered only a few bucks were in it. I mustered these and started them pushing the machine across. All went well until we were about 100 yards from the bank, and judging by their heavy breathing, the blacks were tired. I decided to start up the engine and help them. They were all standing behind having a blow when the old bus fired. That finished the relief party. When I looked around, the blacks had covered 150 yards in about 10 seconds, and all entreaties and demonstrations were of no avail. The machine was devil to them, and they stood off at a safe distance to watch me complete the rest of the pull under my own power. After much coaxing, I induced one old black to sit on the machine. Immediately he hit the seat, he bounced off with one spring and raced away yelling at the top of his voice. I then discovered he had placed his bare toe on the red-hot exhaust pipe. During the night we had a tremendous thunderstorm, so I had to trespass on the hospitality of a settler for 2 days until the country was dry enough to travel. I started with the following directions. Follow cattle pads heading due east to Warramunga Lagoon and cross river between second waterhole and some bogged cattle further down. Follow the creek for 1 mile and pick up pads and follow for 10 miles due east. Cross creek and make for the right of a big hill where a faint cattle pad can be seen, which leads to Inverary, and make for a green tree on the plain. All went well until I got to the creek, Bunda by name. I looked for the hill and discovered one a little to the left. On making for this, I travelled across atrocious country covered with grass and stumps and crab holes for 8 miles. When nearing the hill, I discovered it to be a belt of heavy timber, and way on my right appeared another hill, undoubtedly the one I had missed. I decided to return, but the very thought of recrossing that dreadful plain nearly brought tears to my eyes. Going back was more difficult than I contemplated. My tracks, owing to the rough country, had zigzagged terribly, and I was completely at sea as to how to return. Bushed and thirsty. To add to my troubles, the water bag dragging through the long swordgrass had sprung a leak, and the water had leaked away. For hours I pushed back to where I thought I had left the creek, and camping at night, I had reluctantly to confess that I was completely bushed. Supper with half a jam tin of water saved from the bag, and a piece of sun-baked bread so hard that I had to soak it with my precious water before I could bite it. A mouthful of sickly warm water, then darkness and silence. Everything was hushed and awfully still. I would reflect a little faint-heartedly on my journey, solitary and melancholy in that vast, rugged interior. Mile after mile of dreadful riding. It seemed to be maddening, and as I thought on the road behind, its sands, its cracks, its creeks, its intense heat, its deep and treacherous gorges, a lonesomeness would fall on me like the falling dusk on the land. I would gaze absently at the silent and boundless plain, down the winding rows of scrub and rocks, while nature hushed the world to sleep, when suddenly the howl of a dingo split the stillness and roused me out of my reverie. Tired and weary, I wound my swag around me and sank into oblivion. End of part 1. Beyond the Back Blocks, part 2. Bushed in the uncharted land of Northern Territory during the first motorcycle trip around Australia, by A.W. Grady. I woke at dawn and without breakfast returned 8 miles, but still the country was unfamiliar and thoughts came into my head that had to be driven out. All that day I plugged along in spite of the intense heat and maddening mirages, sparing neither myself nor the machine. Heat was rising from the much abused engine in colourless streams, baking my legs and boots. The hot winds blew fine stinging dust in my face, and the long cane grass was continually swishing into my eyes. I was filled with a prescience of being trapped by storms for water. While it meant salvation, could also mean a long imprisonment in that wild land. When the big wet sets in, all human affairs come to a standstill. The country is one great bog, where neither man nor horse may travel. This thought forced me to ride hard all day. About 4 o'clock, I saw a long fringe of timber and knew it to be a creek. Water lay about 10 miles further down, but I had doubts as to whether I could make it. Travelling on foot was faster and more comfortable than riding the machine. Besides, I was suffering with aches from the previous day's jolting. So I broke down a long stick and mounted my mosquito net on the end as a flag. I erected it by the machine as a guide in case I should come back to find it. Taking the empty water bag, I started off on foot, hungry and thirsty and filthy dirty, to follow the creek down to water. The falling of night stopped further movement. During the night, storm clouds rolled up and thunder started to reverberate over the vast plains, and the vivid lightning enabled me to see for miles around. Grasshoppers, beetles and other insects in countless hordes were attracted by the glow of the fire, foreboding only too truly the approaching storm. A blinding flash of lightning, followed by a blasting crash of thunder, and the storm burst in wild fury over the thirsty plain. For 2 hours it pounded incessantly, compelling me to seek shelter among the thin scrub till the rain ceased as suddenly as it started. The storm that saved the situation. I welcomed the dawn soaked through but happy in my salvation and relief from the intolerable thirst, and on inspecting the road decided to return to the machine and wait till the following day before attempting to travel. Then, being well rested, I started up my ever-willing Douglas and pushed on east until I stumbled over a heavy cattle pad on which were the faint tracks of a buggy wheel. I had actually struck the track. On following it, I could plainly see how I had become lost. After fording the creek, the track, instead of crossing the downs, had swung away to the left and followed around the edge of the desert. After taking a good drink and filling my water bag, I travelled on towards Inverary. Pulling up at the bank of a creek, I could see through the rocks and trees a solid stream of flowing water. Climbing down the rugged sides, I waded in and found it was above my waist. Anxious to push on, I decided to cross at all risks, so I started to prepare the Douglas for a submarine passage. Collecting a few handfuls of grass, I stuffed them tightly into the exhaust pipes, and with a piece of fat kept for lubricating the chains, I greased the carburettor and magneto, then plugged up the end of the carburettor with a piece of greasy cloth. Then, smearing grease over the petrol tank cap, I cautiously started across. In midstream, the handlebars were just visible, and I had to strain to win out and up the opposite bank. Another trip across, and my small but important stock of perishable goods was over. The plugs were withdrawn, and the grand little machine started up with a healthy roar. On arriving at Inverary, I rested the remainder of the day, and on the next morning started onward again with the following directions. 6 miles out due east, pass a waterhole on right. 1 mile ahead, the track cuts over the toe of a little flat-topped Spinifex hill and turns sharp to left. Proceed northeast for 10 miles and strike a creek running north and south. Follow the creek for 3 miles and then cross it at the bottom of a large stony hill and follow base of hill around to a small rocky gorge. Cross the gorge and make for a group of pindamus trees to the right, growing at the foot of a range of low hill. Cross another heavy stony bottom creek and run along the edge of a desert until black soil plains are reached. Cut right through the plains due east to an old yard called 29 Mile Yard. To the North bushman who gave it, that description was concise and ample, but to me it was confusing because of the difficulty of knowing the meaning of words. For instance, desert. The desert country was the red-soiled, lightly timbered land, and the great expanses of sand and dry grass called plains. Downs were the grassy, dry, black soil country, a mass of knotty grass stumps and spinifex honeycombed with crab holes. So, nothing daunted, but not overconfident as my directions were not too plain, I started off. Stopping every half mile, I examined the ground, comparing the notes with the lay of the country. I would discern a small hillock crushed at the base by a wheel, and would then feel as though I were on a macadamized road. Through the downs I followed where the long grass was slightly knocked down by horses, and on the timbered lands where the sight of a piece of bark knocked off a tree by a wheel hub would make me feel confident I was on the right track. At last, no signs whatever appeared, and I began to get a bit faint-hearted. Nothing tallied with the instructions. Mounting the top of a little bald hill, I eagerly searched the horizon for landmarks, but only the wide, boundless plain met my gaze. No hills or strips of timber marking the course of a creek, not a bird or beast to be seen. A few scattered scrub trees dotted the landscape, looking as big as ancient oaks, their size gradually diminishing on approach. Often I have been deceived by small trees no more than 4 feet high, which at 6 miles appear tall and large, and I have even mistaken them for a windmill 30 or 40 feet high. Far away to the left could be seen the creek I had recently crossed, winding its way through the plains until diffused into the hovering mirage. Setting my compass, I picked out a spot due east, and kicking the old bus up, plunged into the long grass and wretched crab holes. I often reflected on the staunchness and willingness of my little mount. Never once did the Douglas refuse duty. It was always ready to push on, yet I often cursed and swore at it as I struggled up the sides of sandy creeks, the engine crackling like a machine gun through the short open exhaust pipes. The machine deserved no such return from me, whom it carried through that vast wilderness. 5 miles I travelled, long thick grass preventing the wind from cooling the sweltering engine, and the heat and smell of burning oil ascended to my head. At last I emerged from the undergrowth of cane and weed and gradually ascended until I could see the rough outline of the barren gorge. Somewhere ahead now I should find water, but of the creek and the old yard there was no sign whatsoever. It was about 2 p.m. and the track to the hilly rugged gorge was covered with large stones. So preferring to walk rather than be jolted to death, I unhitched the water bag and started afoot for the big hills about 1.5 miles distant in order to command a good view of the country. Scrambling to the top, I sat on the stones and let my thoughts wander aimlessly. Forced to return. Vague apprehensions crept into my mind as I gazed at the remains of some unfortunate calf that had wandered. I tapped my bone-dry water bag and its hollow sound chilled me. Then I began to think of lagoons and rivers I knew, thoughts that almost turned my overtaxed and unbalanced mind into delirious ecstasies. Presently, a foul stench from dead cattle reached me, and shaking off my lethargy, I prospected among the gorges and found a pool of beautiful clear water. After a good night's sleep, I decided to return to Inverary, for to go on meant certain defeat. I got back to the station after an arduous struggle. It was at this point that the generosity of the Farquharson brothers was made clear to me. Every station I had passed through, the Farquharsons were noted for kindness and munificence, and with me they never hesitated, but immediately volunteered to lend me a guide with a spare saddle horse and 2 pack horses, for I had not enough petrol to make Wave Hill the next outpost of civilization in that desolate land. Horses to the rescue. So, with the guide and provisions, we hit the trail for Wave Hill and camped first night at Swanwater Hole, 30 miles out. The ground was covered with dry pandanus leaves, which cracked like breaking glass as I rode over. Next day we proceeded to Grave Creek, where the going was indescribable, the mode of travelling being that the guide went ahead, and when he was about 1/4 mile away, I would ride up and stop until he got on again, and so on. But as this black had never seen a motorcycle before, his idea of a road that was anything that a horse could use. As it was all cross-country travelling and shortcuts, I could hardly keep pace with the walking horses. Several times I had to stop and take off the footrests to enable me to cross the stony bottom creeks, and when I would look ahead there would be no sign of rider or horses, so I had to scout around and pick up the tracks, and by catch him up again. When the ground was too stony for tracks, I just sat down and waited for him to return, wondering what would happen if he took it into his head and desert me and go bush. At one point I was dodging along among some boulders when the footrest hit a stone and, bending back, struck the gearbox sprocket, buckling it dangerously, at the same time locking the wheel and sending me sprawling. I had to make a liberal use of the iodine. After dismantling the chains and sprocket, I lit a fire and, selecting a large flat stone, pounded the sprocket back into shape once more. The time taken was about an hour, and there was no sign of the guide. End of Part 2. Beyond the Back Blocks, Part 3. The absence of my temporary guide worried me somewhat, and it was with the relief that presently I heard the thud of hooves as he appeared around the bend. That night we camped at Grave Creek, and at tea time I noticed that as on previous evenings, George the guide was not hungry. So I asked him what was wrong. "Oh, nothing," he said, "all day mine been eating bush plum." As we always went without lunch, I had a sharp appetite in the evening. I said, "Where you get 'em bush plum?" And after tea we wandered around and he showed me the plums. They were small apples and tasted like a cross between a guava and a passion fruit, and were certainly very palatable. Listening in for food. Once he bent down and picked up a small round nut. "See that," he said. "Where you see that, it shows where good food comes from a tree called Sugarbag." I at once wanted to be shown, having doubts about his statement. He went from tree to tree, placing his ear against the trunks until he found one he was looking for. "Plenty Sugarbag," he said. I asked him why. He had placed his ear against the trunk, and he pointed above, where from a hole a number of bees were flying in and out. Placing my own ear against the trunk, I could plainly hear the hum of bees. Taking the tomahawk, he commenced slicing the bark for about 2 feet, and when he had cut into the inner hollow, he laid it bare and scraped the contents onto a flour bag. The stuff was like wax, with the flavour of honey, and was very nice to eat. After this, he stewed me some Congo berries and dug up some wild potatoes growing on a riverbank. The blacks are never short of food in the bush, and will find it where a white man will starve. Next day we travelled over similar country and crossed numerous rocky bottom creeks until we reached our next camp at Blacken Creek. Every now and then George would suddenly leave the trail and gallop off with his eyes glued to the ground, and would sometimes be absent a quarter of an hour. On returning, he would tell me he had been following wild black's tracks. At this camp, the petrol petered out, so leaving the bus, I climbed on the spare horse and we rode 40 miles to Wave Hill for petrol. I made notes of the track, as I was to have no guide when I returned. At last we crossed the gorge, about half a mile across the steep banks, testing the powers of the horses. George said this was the regular crossing place, but knowing no motorcycle could get across, I scouted up and down for an easier place, without success. It was evident that the old bus would have to be carried over in pieces. Satisfied on this point, we proceeded and camped at Bow Hills waterhole, and next day arrived at Wave Hill. On receiving a gallon of petrol there, we returned with the horses to where the bus was left, having ridden 40 miles that day, with the sun at 114 degrees, and we camped at the creek. The machine becomes a passenger. At dawn next day I said goodbye to my guide and travelled in the opposite direction, feeling a little despondent at his departure, for he was an excellent guide and very interesting. But after listening to the last hoof beats of his horses, I struck off for Wave Hill, and on reaching the gorge decided at once on the plan of action. First, taking off the loaded carrier, I carried it over to the opposite bank, and then realised for the first time the load the little machine was pulling. Next, I unbolted the engine and carried that over. Finally, the frame and wheels were brought along and the whole machine reassembled at the other side, but not without breaking 2 radiating fins off the front cylinder. In striking for the big hill, I had noted on the previous day that we followed the base for some 10 miles till I could see the timber marking the course of the river, and struck for the middle of 2 peaks where I knew was the sandy crossing at 29 Mile Yard. The previous day a light fire had been burning, but we had taken little heed of this. Now, as I rounded the bend of the hill, where the vast plain lay before me, I saw thick volumes of smoke rising above the trees. The fire, which had grown into a raging mass of flame, was sweeping over the great expanse, leaving the ground glowing with hot ashes, and the air was filled with black smoke, almost to obscurity, as the leaping flames licked up the dry grass and sun-baked trees. Charred and smoked logs had fallen across my track, and the pad was quite obliterated. Then I congratulated myself on having closely noted the features of the landscape which made me independent of horse tracks. Not more than 50 yards on my right the fire was raging, so I had to keep on the edge of the plain and make detours wherever the flames were in my direct path. Dodging around the fire, I made my landmarks every time I left the pad and, when chance offered, cut the pad again. In this manner I forced my way along, the smell of burning wood mingling with fumes of heated petrol, the burnt ground radiating intolerable heat, and tears burning my vision. Eventually I made the creek and soon after arrived at Wave Hill. While at the station, a 40-pound barramundi was caught in one of the big water holes. The flesh of this fish is very much prized. Homemade lubricating oil. In this part of the country, I was forced to use a special brand of lubricating oil. I made it myself, and any motorcyclist is free to use my recipe. It was a mixture of 6 bottles of castor oil, half a gallon of beef dripping, and 2 pints of windmill oil. The Douglas, if it noticed the difference, never complained. I also travelled 73 miles on kerosene, paraffin, in place of petrol. Often, in this treeless, pathless, waterless place, one had to stop when a waterhole was reached, and then spend a considerable time tracing the tracks one had been following, for the tracks lay in the cattle pads, which are the tracks used by cattle coming into water, and they radiate from the waterhole in star fashion. Anywhere near the water, the cattle obliterate all of the marks, so the quickest method of refinding a track is to make a circuit about a mile out from the water, and when a trail is seen, watch the direction in which it bears, and, if correct, follow it. The following morn, I left Wave Hill at dawn and arrived at Pigeon Hole in time for breakfast. Leaving there, I followed rough roads to Victoria River Downs, where I was received like the prodigal son. This station is undoubtedly the largest in the world. It embraces an area of 14,000 square miles, larger than the whole of Scotland. From Victoria Downs, I was descending a very rugged and stony gorge, and thought I saw movement behind a tree, but the track would not permit me to look round. On reaching the bottom, I cast a glance sideways and again caught sight of movement. Pulling up short, I shouted out, and a black appeared with several spears and a tomahawk. What puzzled me most was that instead of being black, he was a dirty brown, and as he came up, I could see he was covered in brown mud. This was because he had been stalking kangaroos. The mud, being the same colour as the ground, enabled him to crawl close to his game. More blacks who were brown. 30 miles further on, I came to a steep creek and, halting on the bank, experienced what taught me never to take the bus in unless I could see a path out. I walked down and across the riverbed, looking for an easier place to cross. After a little searching, I decided to go back and cross a little lower down. So, turning round to return, I was surprised to see 4 bucks and 3 gins and some pickaninnies standing right behind me, all smothered with the same brown mud. They were well armed, and as one could speak a little English, I learned they were out of the bush and travelling west for food and game. They had quite a collection of spears, tomahawks and boomerangs. I was surprised in a similar manner about 80 miles out of Moranboy, where travelling along a road fairly heavy after rain. Coming on a large pool of water in the track, I circled round it, and just as I regained the road, my front wheel did a wonderful skid and shot me clean over the handlebars. On regaining my feet, I lifted the machine up and was about to start when I heard laughing and giggling, and looking around, there were 2 bucks around 10 yards from me, evidently tickled to death and thinking I was stunting for their entertainment. The way these blacks can appear without sound is almost magical. One moment they are not there, and the next they are. There is no doubt but that on many occasions one is under closer observation than one is conscious of. The unusual noise of the fast-running open exhaust engine undoubtedly attracted them to have a peep at this strange visitor to their wilderness, and are convincing evidence of their wonderful powers between Moranboy and Mataranka. I had laid in a good stock of provisions, jam, biscuits, salmon, bread and beef, strapped on behind. I stopped at a water hole to fill my water bag, only a few yards away, and on turning in to the machine, my bag of provisions was gone. It must have been taken almost immediately by some watching bucks, who feasted while I starved. Swept away by a flooded river. On reaching the Victoria River, which was flowing strongly, I decided to ride across, for they told me the bottom was flat and smooth. I tackled it fairly fast in low gear, plunging straight into the swirling waters. Almost immediately the bus left me and plunged me headlong into the swift water. Springing up, I struggled to the machine and tried to lift it, but helplessly, until by letting the water wash it against a big rock, I managed to stand the machine up. The fall was caused by the green slime with which the bottom of the river is covered, and on this slime the tyres had no grip at all. After 2 more falls, we got across to the far bank. On approaching the Wickham River, I discovered that the far bank was very steep. Profiting by previous experience, I got across without a fall and proceeded to scale the bank. This necessitated running the engine flat out with me pushing flat out as well. Near the top, the bank went nearly straight up for about 10 feet, and by exerting all my power, I counted on doing it with a little luck. The crossing of the stream, of course, left my boots full of water, and as I was putting in some last desperate pushes, both feet slipped out of the boots, and I was hurled clean down the bank onto the rocks below, expecting the machine to land on top of me. On recovering from the fall, I looked for the bus, and there it was, just where I had left it. The footrest had dug into the heavy soil and anchored it on the spot. The most northerly point. From this point I am going to move ahead fast on paper, for a detailed description would be a repetition of the rough riding story which would weary my readers. The next station touched was Delamere, and in 100 miles the most northerly point in the Katherine was reached. Once again I was in touch with the world by telegraph. The dreadful stretch from Hall's Creek was past, and I was still alive and kicking. The little Douglas seemed as fit as when she left Fremantle, and the Bates tyres were practically unmarked, and actually unpunctured. Many times I have had reason to bless the grand workmanship and material of these two firms, for my life depended on them. From the Catherine across the King River, infested with alligators, is 100 miles. Then to Moranboy, 40. Mataranka, 46. Daly Waters, 125. And Newcastle Waters, 110. From Catherine, I followed the Adelaide-Darwin telegraph line, which runs southwest to south, and it was a great comfort to have the line for a guide. From Newcastle Waters, I struck east to Anthony's Lagoon, 180 miles, then 60 to Brunette Downs, and followed the rough stock route on through Alexandria and Rankin to Camooweal. Known roads and civilization. At this last town I said goodbye to the terrible Northern Territory and stepped onto Queensland soil, my troubles at an end. From now onward I was on known roads and civilization. I simply followed the inland route to Brisbane. My reception at various capitals, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Adelaide, was of a most flattering nature, and while I thoroughly appreciated the kindly wishes behind all the receptions, I was glad to have done with them and set my face towards home. The track from Adelaide to Perth runs through the wilds, but it is a known road and has been travelled many times by motorists and motorcyclists. To me, it was a comparatively easy run, and the Douglas purred along contentedly day by day until on March the 14th, I had the great pleasure of riding down the streets of my native town of Fremantle, and the Douglas registered the last of billions of beats in front of the town hall, which I had left 5 months and 14 days before. The great journey is finished, and I am quietly satisfied with the honour of being the first to do it. To the Douglas machine and to the Bates tyres I cannot give too much honour. Not one spare part was used on the machine, which never once failed me, and the tyres never once punctured. The end. Read by Chris Potter, February 2023.